Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he crouched behind the fallen tree trunk. The morning mist hung thick over the marshland, making everything look like a ghostly dream. He had been running for 3 days now, ever since the incident at the research facility. His backpack felt heavy with the stolen documents, but he knew they contained evidence that could expose the entire operation. The bog stretched endlessly in all directions, its dark water reflecting the gray sky above. Twisted branches reached up from the murky depths like skeletal fingers, and the air smelled of decay and rotting vegetation. Marcus had chosen this route because he thought it would be the last place anyone would look for him. He was wrong. Dr. Sarah Chen had warned him this would happen. She had been working at the facility for 2 years, pretending to be just another researcher while secretly documenting the illegal experiments. When she discovered what they were really doing to the test subjects, she knew she had to get the information out. But she also knew she couldn't do it alone. Marcus had been a journalist before everything went wrong. He had a reputation for exposing corruption in high places, which made him both valuable and dangerous. When Sarah contacted him through encrypted channels, he didn't hesitate. The story she told him was horrific, but he knew it had to be told. The facility was hidden deep in the mountains, disguised as a legitimate pharmaceutical research center. On the surface, they claimed to be developing new treatments for rare diseases. But underground, in levels that didn't appear on any official blueprint, they were conducting experiments that violated every ethical principle of modern medicine. Sarah had shown him the footage she had secretly recorded. Subjects who had volunteered for what they thought were routine drug trials were being exposed to experimental compounds that altered their brain chemistry in permanent ways. Some lost their memories completely. Others developed violent tendencies they couldn't control. The worst cases simply disappeared, their files deleted as if they had never existed. The company behind it all was Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a massive corporation with connections reaching into the highest levels of government. Their CEO, Richard Blackstone, had built his empire on the promise of revolutionary medical breakthroughs. But the real breakthrough they were working on wasn't about healing people. It was about control. Marcus had spent weeks gathering additional evidence, interviewing former employees who had been too scared to speak before, and tracing financial records that showed how deep the conspiracy went. But somewhere along the way, someone noticed what he was doing. The first sign of trouble came when Sarah missed their scheduled meeting. When he went to her apartment, he found signs of a struggle and her laptop missing. Her neighbor said she had seen men in dark suits leaving the building earlier that morning. That's when Marcus knew they were both in serious danger. He grabbed everything he could carry and ran. The documents Sarah had given him were hidden in a waterproof case inside his backpack, along with the recordings and photographs that proved everything they had discovered. He knew that if those materials fell into the wrong hands, not only would the truth never come out, but other innocent people would continue to suffer. Now, 3 days later, he was lost in a bog that seemed to have no end. His food was running low. His boots were soaked through, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. But he kept moving because he knew that somewhere out there, people were counting on him to get the truth to safety. The silence of the marsh was broken only by the occasional splash of water or the call of a distant bird. Marcus tried to stay alert, but exhaustion was taking its toll. His legs felt like lead and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. Every few minutes he would stop and listen, trying to detect any sound that might indicate he was being followed. As the day wore on, the mist began to thin slightly, revealing more of the desolate landscape around him. The bog was larger than he had imagined, stretching for miles in every direction. Ancient trees stood like sentinels in the shallow water, their roots creating a maze of natural barriers that made navigation nearly impossible. Marcus pulled out his compass and tried to get his bearings, but the metal seemed unreliable in this strange environment. The magnetic field felt different here, as if the very earth was trying to confuse him. He had heard stories about places like this, where the natural minerals in the ground could interfere with electronic equipment. By late afternoon, he found what appeared to be a small island of solid ground in the middle of the marsh. It was covered with thick grass and surrounded by reeds that provided some natural camouflage. He decided to rest there for a few hours, knowing that he would need his strength for whatever lay ahead. As he settled down behind the reeds, Marcus allowed himself to think about what would happen if he didn't make it out of this place. The documents in his backpack represented the hopes of dozens of people who had been victimized by Meridian's experiments. Their families deserved to know what had happened to them. The public deserved to know what kind of company they were supporting with their trust and their money. But more than that, Marcus knew that if this conspiracy wasn't exposed, it would continue and even expand. The technology they were developing could be used to control entire populations, turning ordinary people into mindless followers or violent aggressors at the flip of a switch. The implications were terrifying. He thought about Sarah and wondered what had happened to her. Had they simply taken her somewhere to interrogate her, or was she already dead? The not knowing was almost worse than any certainty would have been. She had risked everything to bring this information to light, and now she was paying the price for her courage. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. He would find a way out of this marsh, and he would get the evidence to people who could act on it. Too many lives depended on it for him to give up now. The temperature began to drop as darkness approached, and Marcus knew he would have to find better shelter soon. The bog would be even more dangerous at night, with hidden pools of deep water and unstable ground that could swallow a person without warning. But he also knew that darkness might provide the cover he needed to move more safely. He was just beginning to plan his next move when he heard it, the distant sound of voices carried on the evening breeze. They were still far away, but they were definitely human voices, and they seemed to be getting closer. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the reeds, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it could be heard across the water. The voices were getting clearer now, and he could make out at least 3 different men talking in low professional tones. These weren't casual hikers or lost tourists. These were people who knew exactly what they were doing and why they were here. Through the evening mist, he could see the beams of powerful flashlights sweeping across the marsh in systematic patterns. The search team was organized and methodical, which meant they were probably military or private security contractors. Either way, they were dangerous and well-trained. The lead voice belonged to someone with a gravelly tone and what sounded like a slight southern accent. Marcus strained to listen as the man gave orders to his team. They were using code words and technical language that confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just a search party. This was a termination squad. From what he could overhear, they had been tracking him since yesterday using some kind of sophisticated equipment. They knew approximately where he was and were systematically sweeping the area to flush him out. The man in charge, who the others called Commander, seemed confident that they would have him within hours. Marcus carefully opened his backpack and checked his supplies. He had 2 energy bars left, a half-full water bottle, and the waterproof case containing all the evidence. His phone had died hours ago, which was probably for the best since they might be able to track it. He also had a small flashlight, but using it now would be like sending up a flare. The temperature continued to drop as full darkness settled over the bog. The mist grew thicker, which would make it harder for the search team to see him, but it would also make it much more difficult for him to navigate. Every step would be a gamble, with the constant risk of walking into deep water or getting completely turned around. As he listened to the search team's movements, Marcus began to form a mental map of their positions. The commander seemed to be coordinating from a central location, while 2 other men swept in wide arcs on either side. They were trying to create a net that would prevent him from escaping in any direction, but there was something they didn't know about Marcus that might give him an advantage. Before becoming a journalist, he had spent 4 years in the army, including a tour of duty in Afghanistan where he had learned advanced survival and evasion techniques. The skills he had developed in those mountains and deserts were different from what he needed in a swamp, but the basic principles were the same. The key was to think like the enemy while avoiding their patterns. Most people, when being hunted, would try to move as far and as fast as possible in a straight line, but that was exactly what the search team would expect. Instead, Marcus decided to do something counterintuitive. He would move toward them. Carefully, he repacked his supplies and began to crawl through the shallow water at the edge of the small island. The cold liquid soaked through his clothes immediately, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. The reeds provided some cover, but he had to be incredibly careful not to create any splashing sounds that might give away his position. As he moved, Marcus could hear the search team getting closer. Their flashlight beams were now sweeping the area where he had been resting just minutes before. He held his breath as one of the lights passed directly over his hiding spot in the reeds. But somehow the man holding it didn't notice the slight disturbance in the water, The plan was risky, but it was his best chance. By moving closer to the search team instead of away from them, he hoped to slip through their perimeter, while they were focused on looking ahead for him. It was a classic military tactic, but it required perfect timing and a lot of luck. Through the darkness, Marcus could now see the shadowy figure of one of the searchers about 50 yards away. The man was wearing what looked like military-style clothing and carrying some kind of assault rifle. His movements were professional and careful, but Marcus could tell he was getting frustrated with the difficult terrain. That frustration might be the key to everything. The search team was expecting to find someone who was panicked and running blindly through the marsh. They weren't prepared for someone who might actually use the environment to his advantage. The bog that had seemed like such a hostile place to Marcus was about to become his ally. As he continued his careful movement through the water, Marcus began to notice things about the marsh that he hadn't seen before. There were patterns in the way the water flowed, subtle currents that indicated deeper channels and shallower areas. The placement of the dead trees wasn't random either. They formed natural corridors that could provide both cover and relatively safe passage if you knew how to read them. But the most important thing he noticed was the wind. It was shifting direction regularly, which meant that sounds would be carried in unpredictable ways. A voice that seemed to come from the right might actually be coming from the left. Splashing that seemed close might be much farther away than it appeared. This confusion would work both ways, but Marcus hoped he could use it to his advantage. The search team was starting to spread out more as they covered the area where Marcus had been hiding. He could hear the commander giving new orders, telling his men to expand their search pattern. This was the moment he had been waiting for. As they moved farther apart, there would be gaps in their coverage that he might be able to slip through. Moving with infinite care, Marcus began to work his way around the edge of what appeared to be a deeper pool of water. The bottom was soft and muddy, making each step treacherous, but the deeper water would muffle any sounds he made. He could feel things moving in the water around his legs, but he forced himself not to think about what they might be. 20 yards away, he could see the silhouette of one of the searchers moving methodically through the reeds. The man's flashlight beam swept back and forth in a regular pattern, but there were brief moments when it pointed a way that might give Marcus the opening he needed. Just as he was preparing to make his move, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. The commander's voice, much closer than before, was talking to someone on a radio. From what he could make out, they weren't the only search team. There were others positioned at various points around the marsh, creating a much larger net than Marcus had realized. Even worse, the radio conversation revealed that they had night vision equipment and possibly thermal imaging devices. The darkness that Marcus had been counting on for protection might not be enough. If they had military-grade technology, hiding in the cold water might be his only chance of avoiding detection. But then he heard something else that changed everything. The commander mentioned a time limit. They had been ordered to find him before dawn, which was still several hours away. After that, the mission would be called off and handled differently. Marcus didn't know what that meant exactly, but he suspected it involved much more serious resources, possibly including helicopters or tracking dogs. This new information gave him both hope and urgency. If he could evade capture until morning, he might have a chance. But he would have to survive the next few hours in increasingly dangerous conditions, while being hunted by professionals with superior equipment. Marcus waited in the freezing water until his legs went numb. The search team had moved past his position, but he could still hear their voices echoing across the marsh. He knew this was his chance to move, but every instinct told him to stay hidden. The water was so cold now that his teeth were chattering, and he had to clench his jaw to keep quiet. Slowly, he began to wade through the deeper channel he had discovered. The water came up to his chest in some places, and the current was stronger than he had expected. Several times he nearly lost his footing on the slippery bottom, but he managed to keep moving forward. The waterproof case with the evidence bumped against his back with each step, reminding him of what was at stake. As he moved, Marcus started to piece together more of what he was hearing from the search team's radio communications. The commander was reporting to someone called Control, and it was clear that this operation was much bigger than just finding one missing journalist. They were talking about containing a security breach and implementing something called Protocol 7. The mention of Protocol 7 made Marcus's stomach drop. During his military service, he had heard references to various numbered protocols, and they usually involved eliminating threats permanently. Sarah had mentioned something similar in her notes about the research facility. Meridian Pharmaceuticals had their own set of protocols for dealing with security issues, and none of them ended well for the people involved. After what felt like hours of careful movement through the water, Marcus found himself approaching what looked like the remains of an old wooden structure. As he got closer, he could see it was the collapsed framework of what might have been a hunting blind or observation platform. The wood was rotted and covered with moss, but it provided some solid ground to rest on. He pulled himself up onto the platform and immediately felt relief as his legs finally got out of the cold water. But the relief was short-lived as he heard new voices approaching from a different direction. The search team had apparently called for backup, and now there were even more people looking for him. From his position on the old platform, Marcus could see the flashlight beams of at least 6 different searchers spread out across the marsh. They were being much more systematic now, working in a coordinated grid pattern that would be almost impossible to avoid. He realized that his only chance was to find a way out of the bog entirely before they completed their sweep. Looking around from his elevated position, Marcus could see something in the distance that hadn't been visible from water level. Far to the east, beyond the thickest part of the marsh, there appeared to be a line of trees that looked different from the dead and dying vegetation around him. Those trees were taller and fuller, which meant they were probably growing on solid ground. But getting there would mean crossing the most dangerous part of the bog, where the water was deepest and the ground most unstable. It would also mean moving in the direction where most of the search team seemed to be concentrated. It was a huge risk, but staying where he was would only delay the inevitable. As he prepared to move again, Marcus heard something that made him freeze. One of the searchers was talking about bringing in dogs at first light. Tracking dogs would be able to follow his scent even through the water, making it virtually impossible to hide. He had to get out of this area completely before dawn, which gave him maybe 3 hours at most. The decision was made for him when he heard footsteps on solid ground much closer than expected. Someone was approaching the old platform from the west, moving carefully but steadily in his direction. Marcus slipped back into the water as quietly as possible and began moving toward the eastern edge of the bog. This part of the marsh was even more treacherous than what he had already crossed. The water was deeper and filled with fallen logs and twisted roots that created a maze of obstacles. Several times he had to duck completely under the surface to avoid getting tangled up, holding his breath while the cold, murky water closed over his head. The worst part was not knowing what else might be in the water with him. He could feel things brushing against his legs, and once something large moved just beneath the surface near his feet. He tried not to think about snakes or alligators or whatever other creatures might call this place home. As he struggled through the deeper water, Marcus began to hear something that gave him hope. In the distance, beyond the search team's voices and the sounds of the marsh, he could make out what sounded like traffic. It was faint but definitely there, the low hum of vehicles on a road. If he could reach that road, he might be able to flag down help or at least get away from this nightmare. But between him and that road was still at least half a mile of dangerous terrain, and the search team was getting closer. He could hear the commander giving new orders, directing his men to tighten their search pattern. They knew approximately where he was, and they were closing in fast. Marcus pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the numbness in his extremities. The evidence in his backpack felt heavier with each step, but he knew that losing it now would mean that everyone who had suffered at the hands of Meridian Pharmaceuticals would never get justice. As he moved, he started to notice that the character of the marsh was changing. The water was becoming shallower in some places, and there were patches of firmer ground that allowed him to move faster. The trees were definitely getting taller and healthier looking, which confirmed that he was heading in the right direction. But the search team was adapting too. He could hear them calling out to each other, coordinating their movements to cut off his escape routes. They had figured out which direction he was heading, and they were trying to get ahead of him. The professional nature of their operation was becoming more apparent with each passing minute. Then Marcus heard something that changed the entire situation. One of the searchers called out that they had found evidence of his passage, probably footprints or broken reeds where he had climbed out of the water. The discovery triggered a flurry of radio communications, and suddenly all the search beams were converging on his general area. He had to move faster now, even if it meant making more noise. The time for stealth was over. Now it was just a race to reach safety before they caught up with him. Marcus began pushing through the water as quickly as possible, no longer worried about splashing or disturbing the wildlife. Behind him, he could hear the search team getting closer. Their flashlights were powerful enough that he could see the beams reflecting off the water around him. The commander was shouting orders now, and Marcus could hear the excitement in his voice. They thought they had him cornered, but Marcus had one advantage they didn't know about. During his movement through the marsh, he had been paying attention to the wind patterns and the way sounds carried across the water. He had a pretty good idea of where each searcher was positioned, and he had noticed something important. There was a gap in their coverage along the northern edge of their search pattern. If he could reach that gap before they realized what he was doing, he might still have a chance. It would mean changing direction and heading through some of the most difficult terrain he had encountered yet. But it was better than walking straight into their trap. As he began to alter his course, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, someone was screaming. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded like someone in terrible pain or fear. For a moment, he thought it might be Sarah. But then he realized the voice was coming from the wrong direction entirely. The screaming continued for several seconds before being abruptly cut off, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to hang over the entire marsh. Even the search team had stopped moving, apparently as disturbed by the sound as Marcus was. Whatever had happened, it wasn't part of their operation. The silence that followed the screaming was more terrifying than any noise Marcus had heard all night. Even the search team had stopped moving and their radio chatter had gone quiet. Whatever had just happened in the marsh was something none of them had expected, and it had shaken everyone's confidence. Marcus used the confusion to his advantage, pushing through the water as quietly as possible toward what he hoped was the gap in their search pattern. The beam from his small flashlight, kept covered by his hand, revealed that he was finally reaching the edge of the bog. The water was getting shallower and he could feel solid ground beneath his feet more often. But as he moved, he began to notice things that didn't make sense. There were structures in this part of the marsh that looked man-made but very old. Pieces of concrete and twisted metal stuck up from the water at odd angles, creating a maze of hazards that could easily trap someone who wasn't careful. As Marcus climbed over what appeared to be the remains of a concrete wall, he realized he had stumbled into something that had been hidden in this remote location for a very long time. The ruins were extensive, suggesting this had once been a significant installation of some kind. Given the remote location and the obvious attempts to conceal it, he suspected it hadn't been something the general public was supposed to know about. His suspicions were confirmed when he found a piece of metal with barely visible lettering. Using his covered flashlight, he could make out part of what looked like a government facility designation. The numbers and codes matched patterns he had seen during his military service. This had been some kind of classified research installation, probably abandoned decades ago. The discovery made Marcus wonder if his presence here wasn't as coincidental as he had thought. Meridian Pharmaceuticals was involved in secret research that violated ethical boundaries. What if they had connections to this old facility? What if the bog had been chosen as a hunting ground precisely because it already contained secrets that certain people wanted to keep buried? As he picked his way through the ruins, Marcus heard the search team starting to move again. The commander was giving orders in a voice that sounded more urgent than before. They had apparently decided that whatever had caused the screaming wasn't their immediate problem. Finding Marcus was still their priority, but there was something different about their movements now. They seemed more cautious and their formation had tightened up. The unknown element that had disrupted their operation was making them nervous, which might work in Marcus's favor if he could figure out how to use it. Moving through the ruins was treacherous in the dark. The concrete was cracked and broken, creating hidden gaps that could easily break an ankle. Rusted metal stuck out at dangerous angles, and the whole area was partially flooded with stagnant water that smelled of decay and chemicals. As Marcus carefully climbed over another collapsed wall, his foot slipped and he fell hard against a piece of metal debris. The impact was loud enough that he was sure the search team would hear it, but more importantly, the sharp edge had torn through his backpack. He frantically checked the waterproof case containing the evidence, relieved to find it still intact. But several of his other supplies had spilled into the murky water. The noise from his fall had definitely been heard. Almost immediately, Marcus could see flashlight beams turning in his direction, and the radio chatter picked up again. The commander was directing his team toward the ruins. which meant Marcus's hiding place was about to become very dangerous. But as he prepared to move deeper into the ruins to avoid capture, Marcus heard something that stopped him cold. There were other voices in the area, voices that didn't belong to the search team. They were speaking in whispers, but they were definitely human, and they seemed to be moving through the ruins with familiarity that suggested they knew this place well. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The screaming he had heard earlier hadn't come from some random victim. There were other people in these ruins, people who had been here long enough to know their way around. But who were they and what did they want? As if in answer to his question, a voice spoke from the darkness just a few feet away from where he was hiding. "Don't move and don't make a sound," it said in barely audible whisper. "They're not the only ones hunting you." Marcus froze, unsure whether this new development was good or bad for his chances of survival. The voice belonged to a woman, and there was something about her tone that suggested she wasn't working with the search team. But that didn't necessarily make her a friend. "Who are you?" he whispered back so quietly he wasn't sure she would hear him. "Someone who knows what you're carrying," came the reply, "and someone who knows what they'll do to you if they catch you. We can help each other, but you have to trust me." The offer of help was tempting, especially with the search team closing in, but Marcus had learned not to trust anyone easily. Too many people had already died because of the information he carried, and he couldn't risk it falling into the wrong hands. "How do I know you're not working for them?" he asked. There was a pause before she answered. "Because if I was, you'd already be dead. These ruins have been my home for 3 years, ever since I escaped from the same facility you're trying to expose. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I used to work for Meridian Pharmaceuticals." The name hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been mentioned in Sarah's notes as one of the researchers who had disappeared after asking too many questions about the experiments. According to the official story, she had quit and moved overseas. But if she was here hiding in these ruins, then that story was obviously a lie. "Sarah Chen told me you were dead," Marcus whispered. "Sarah's alive, but they have her at a facility about 20 miles from here. That's where they took me when I first tried to expose what they were doing. I managed to escape, but I've been trapped here ever since. They have people watching all the roads and towns in the area." This revelation changed everything Marcus thought he knew about his situation. If Elena was telling the truth, then Sarah was still alive and there might be a way to rescue her. But it also meant that the conspiracy was even larger than he had imagined, with multiple facilities and resources that could keep people imprisoned indefinitely. "The evidence I'm carrying," Marcus said. "It's not just from one facility, is it?" "No," Elena replied. "Meridian has at least 6 active sites, maybe more. What Sarah documented is just the tip of the iceberg, but that information, combined with what I know about their other operations, could bring down the entire network." Before Marcus could respond, the search team's flashlights suddenly illuminated the area around them. The commander was leading his men directly toward their hiding spot, and there was nowhere left to run. The ruins that had seemed like salvation were about to become a trap, but Elena was already moving, leading Marcus through a passage between 2 collapsed walls that he would never have found on his own. She moved with the confidence of someone who had memorized every inch of this place, guiding him through obstacles and around hazards with practiced ease. "This way," she whispered urgently. "There's a tunnel that leads to the other side of the bog, but we have to move fast. Once they realize we're in the ruins, they'll call for backup." As they moved through the darkness, Marcus could hear the search team spreading out behind them. The commander was shouting orders, and it was clear that they had found the evidence of his passage through the area. The systematic search pattern was breaking down as they tried to cover the complex terrain of the ruins. Elena led him to what looked like a solid concrete wall, but when she pressed against a particular section, it swung inward to reveal a hidden passage. The opening was just large enough for one person at a time, and it disappeared into complete darkness. The tunnel was built as an emergency escape route when this place was operational, she explained as they squeezed through the opening. "It's been flooded for years, but it's still passable if you don't mind getting wet." As they entered the tunnel, Marcus could hear the search team getting closer to their location. Flashlight beams were now visible through cracks in the concrete above them, and voices were echoing off the ruins in all directions. They had made it through the hidden entrance just in time, but ahead of them lay a flooded tunnel of unknown length. leading into darkness that could hide any number of dangers. And behind them, professional killers were closing in fast. The flooded tunnel was a nightmare of cold water and absolute darkness. Elena led the way with a small waterproof flashlight, its beam revealing concrete walls covered with decades of slime and rust stains. The water came up to their waists, and Marcus could feel things floating in it that he preferred not to identify. "How much further?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the claustrophobic conditions. "About half a mile," Elena replied. The tunnel connects to an old drainage system that was built to divert water from the facility during construction. It hasn't been maintained in years, so some sections might be blocked. As they waded through the murky water, Elena began to tell Marcus more about what had happened to her after she disappeared from Meridian. She had been taken to what the company called a rehabilitation center, but it was actually a prison where former employees who knew too much were kept indefinitely. "They don't always kill people who become security risks," she explained. "Sometimes it's more useful to keep them alive but contained. They had about 30 people at the facility where they took me, all former employees or test subjects who couldn't be allowed to return to normal society." The conditions Elena described were horrific. The prisoners were subjected to regular psychological evaluation and experimental treatments designed to alter their memories or suppress their ability to communicate effectively. Some were given drugs that caused permanent brain damage, while others were simply kept in isolation until they lost their sanity. "I was there for 8 months before I managed to escape," she continued, "but even then I couldn't go far. They have monitoring stations throughout this entire region, and facial recognition software that can identify former employees anywhere within a 100-mile radius." Marcus was beginning to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. Meridian Pharmaceuticals wasn't just conducting illegal experiments. They had created an entire shadow system of control that could make people disappear permanently while maintaining complete deniability. "The evidence I'm carrying," he said. "Will it be enough to expose all of this?" Elena paused in the tunnel and turned to look at him. "It's a start, but we need more. The facilities are designed to be abandoned quickly if they're ever discovered. By the time any investigation could be mounted, all the evidence would be destroyed and the personnel relocated to other sites." They continued through the tunnel, their progress slow but steady. The water seemed to be getting deeper in some sections, and Marcus worried that they might reach a point where the passage was completely flooded. But Elena pressed on with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before. After what felt like hours, they finally saw a faint light ahead. Elena explained that it was coming from a drainage outlet that opened into a stream on the far side of the bog. But as they approached the exit, she suddenly stopped and held up her hand for silence. From somewhere above them came the sound of voices and footsteps. The search team had apparently discovered the tunnel entrance and was following their trail. But these weren't the same voices they had been hearing earlier. These people were speaking in what sounded like Russian or Eastern European accents. "That's not the team that was chasing you before," Elena whispered. "Meridian uses contractors from several different countries for their security operations. If they're bringing in the international teams, it means this has become a much higher priority." The realization that they were now being hunted by multiple teams made their situation even more desperate. Marcus could hear splashing behind them as the new search team entered the flooded tunnel. They were moving fast, apparently unconcerned about making noise now that they had found the trail. Elena quickened her pace, leading Marcus toward the drainage outlet with urgent efficiency. But as they approached the exit, she suddenly grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Wait," she whispered. "There's someone outside." Through the outlet opening, Marcus could see the beam of a flashlight sweeping back and forth across the stream. Someone was positioned at the tunnel exit, waiting for them to emerge. It was a perfect trap. They were caught between the team coming up behind them and whoever was waiting outside. But Elena wasn't ready to give up. She led Marcus to what looked like a solid wall but turned out to be another concealed entrance. This one opened into a narrower passage that branched off from the main tunnel. "Emergency access route," she explained. "It leads to a different exit about 200 yards downstream. But it's going to be tight, and parts of it might be completely underwater." The narrow passage was barely wide enough for one person, and the ceiling was so low they had to crawl on their hands and knees through the freezing water. Marcus could hear his pursuers getting closer in the main tunnel, their voices echoing off the concrete walls as they coordinated their search. As they crawled through the cramped space, Elena told Marcus about the other survivors she had encountered during her time hiding in the ruins. Some were former Meridian employees like herself, while others were test subjects who had managed to escape from various facilities. They had formed a loose network of people who helped each other avoid recapture, but their resources were limited, and their situation was always precarious. There are safe houses scattered throughout the region, she explained, but most of them have been compromised. Meridian has infiltrators everywhere, including local law enforcement and emergency services. That's why we've had to stay in places like this, where normal people won't go. The emergency passage seemed to go on forever, with several sections where the water was deep enough that they had to hold their breath and swim through completely submerged areas. Marcus was beginning to wonder if they would make it out alive when Elena finally stopped at what appeared to be another dead end. But when she pressed against a specific section of the wall, it shifted slightly, revealing that it was actually a heavy metal grate that could be moved aside. Beyond it was natural daylight, the first Marcus had seen since entering the bog days ago. They emerged into a small grove of trees beside a shallow stream, the morning sun filtering through the branches overhead. Marcus had never been so happy to see sunlight, but Elena immediately pulled him into the cover of the trees. "We're not safe yet," she warned. "They'll have teams positioned along all the waterways in this area. We need to get to higher ground and figure out our next move." As they climbed up from the stream bed, Marcus could hear helicopters in the distance. The sound was getting closer, which meant Meridian was escalating their search efforts significantly. Soon the entire area would be crawling with searchers using advanced equipment. Elena led him to what appeared to be an abandoned hunting cabin hidden among the trees. The structure was old and weathered, but it provided solid cover from aerial surveillance. Inside, Marcus was surprised to find that the cabin was well stocked with supplies and communications equipment. "This is one of our monitoring posts," Elena explained. "We've been tracking Meridian's operations throughout the region and documenting everything we can. But we've never had evidence as comprehensive as what you're carrying." She showed Marcus a wall covered with maps, photographs, and documents that revealed the true extent of Meridian's activities. There were at least 8 facilities within a 100-mile radius, each specializing in different types of research. Some focused on psychological manipulation, others on biological weapons, and still others on technologies that Marcus couldn't even begin to understand. "The facility where they're holding Sarah is here," Elena said, pointing to a location on the map about 20 miles to the north. "It's one of their newer installations, designed specifically for containing people who know too much about their operations." Marcus studied the layout of the facility as Elena described its security measures. It was heavily fortified and isolated, with multiple layers of protection that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. But Elena had been inside and she knew its weaknesses. "There's a service tunnel that connects to the facility's power plant," she explained. "It's not heavily guarded because most people don't know it exists. If we can get inside through that route, we might be able to reach the detention area where they're keeping Sarah." The plan was risky, but Marcus knew they had to try. Sarah had risked everything to expose Meridian's crimes, and leaving her in their hands wasn't an option. But first, they needed to get the evidence to safety and make sure it could be released even if their rescue attempt failed. Elena had contacts in the outside world, journalists and activists who had been waiting for exactly this kind of proof. Using the cabin's secure communications equipment, they began transmitting copies of the documents and recordings to multiple recipients simultaneously. As the data uploads progressed, Marcus watched the helicopters circling overhead and thought about how much his life had changed in just a few days. He had started as a journalist investigating a story, but now he was part of something much larger and more dangerous. "Once this information goes public," Elena said, "Meridian will do everything they can to discredit it and silence anyone involved. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus looked at the evidence spread out before them, thinking about all the people who had suffered because of Meridian's experiments. "I've come this far," he said. "We finished this." The rescue mission had to wait until nightfall, but Elena used the daylight hours to prepare Marcus for what they would face at the detention facility. The building was a converted psychiatric hospital that Meridian had purchased through a shell company, allowing them to hold people indefinitely under the guise of providing specialized mental health treatment. As the sun began to set, Elena gathered weapons and equipment that had been hidden throughout the cabin. Marcus was surprised by the military-grade gear she had access to, but she explained that several former government agents and military personnel had joined their resistance network over the years. The people hunting us aren't the only ones with training and resources, she said, checking the ammunition in a compact assault rifle. We've learned to fight back. They left the cabin as darkness fell, moving through the forest with night vision goggles that Elena had provided. The detention facility was located in an isolated valley, surrounded by electric fences and guard towers that were designed to keep people in rather than out. The service tunnel Elena had mentioned was accessed through a
maintenance building about half a mile from the main facility.
Getting there required crossing open ground that was patrolled by security teams, but Elena had timed their approach to coincide with a shift change that would create a brief window of opportunity. As they crawled through tall grass toward the maintenance building, Marcus could see the detention facility in the distance. It looked like a normal medical complex from the outside, with well-maintained buildings and landscaping that gave no hint of the horrors taking place inside. Elena disabled the alarm system on the maintenance building with practiced efficiency, revealing that she had done this before. Inside, they found the entrance to the service tunnel, a narrow concrete passage that led directly under the facility's security perimeter. The tunnel was dry but filled with electrical cables and pipes that made movement difficult. Elena led the way with a small flashlight, counting her steps to navigate by landmarks she had memorized during her escape years earlier. Detention area is in the basement of the main building, she whispered, as they crawled through the confined space. There are usually only 2 guards on duty at night, but they have cameras covering all the main corridors. When they reached the facility's power plant, Elena showed Marcus how to access the building's electrical systems. With a few precise cuts to specific cables, she was able to disable the security cameras in the detention area without triggering any alarms. The basement of the main building was a maze of sterile corridors lined with heavy metal doors. Each door had a small window that allowed them to look into the cells beyond. Most were empty, but in the 3rd cell they checked, Marcus saw a familiar face. Sarah Chen was lying on a narrow bed, her appearance showing the effects of whatever treatments she had been subjected to. Her hair had been cut short, and she looked thinner than Marcus remembered. But she was alive and appeared to be conscious. Elena produced a key card that she had stolen during her own escape, and the cell door opened with a soft electronic beep. Sarah looked up in confusion as they entered, her eyes having trouble focusing on their faces. "Marcus," she said in a voice that sounded distant and confused. "How did you find me? Are you real?" It was clear that Sarah had been subjected to psychological manipulation, designed to make her question her own perceptions. Elena knelt beside the bed and spoke to her in calm, reassuring tones while Marcus checked the corridor for guards. "We're going to get you out of here," Elena said. "But I need you to focus on my voice and trust what you're seeing. They've been giving you drugs to confuse your thinking, but the effects will wear off once we get you away from here." As Sarah struggled to sit up, Marcus heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone was approaching, and they had nowhere to hide in the small cell. Elena drew her weapon and positioned herself beside the door, ready to take down whoever came through. But instead of guards, the footsteps belonged to another prisoner, a man in his 50s wearing the same institutional clothing as Sarah. He looked at them with surprised recognition and held up his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "Dr. Vasquez?" he said in amazement. "I thought you were dead. Everyone said you had been eliminated." Elena recognized him as Dr. Robert Chen, Sarah's father, who had been taken by Meridian 6 months earlier, after he started asking questions about his daughter's disappearance. His presence at the facility explained why Sarah had been so devastated by Meridian's actions. They hadn't just been targeting her research, they had been targeting her family. The reunion between Sarah and her father provided the motivation she needed to overcome the effects of the drugs. With Elena's help, she was able to stand and walk, though her movements were still unsteady. But as they prepared to leave the detention area, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Someone had discovered their presence, and security teams would be responding within minutes. Their careful infiltration had turned into a race against time. Elena led them back toward the service tunnel, but the route was now blocked by guards who had been alerted to the breach. They were forced to find an alternative escape route. moving through maintenance areas and emergency exits while sirens wailed around them. As they reached the facility's main entrance, Marcus could see vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Meridian's security forces were converging on the building, determined to prevent their prisoners from escaping a second time. But Elena had prepared for this possibility. Hidden near the entrance was a motorcycle that could carry all four of them if they didn't mind being cramped. As security personnel poured out of the approaching vehicles, they roared away into the darkness. The chase that followed was harrowing, with armed vehicles pursuing them along winding mountain roads while helicopters circled overhead. But Elena knew the terrain better than their pursuers, and she led them through shortcuts and back roads that eventually allowed them to lose their followers. They reunited with other members of the resistance network at a safe house that had been prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. Within hours, the evidence Marcus had been carrying was being broadcast around the world, exposing Meridian Pharmaceuticals' crimes to public scrutiny. The story broke simultaneously on dozens of news outlets, making it impossible for Meridian to suppress or discredit. Government agencies in multiple countries launched investigations, and the company's stock price collapsed as investors fled. Sarah and her father were reunited with their family, while Elena emerged from hiding to testify before congressional committees about Meridian's activities. Marcus continued his work as a journalist, but now he was part of a larger movement dedicated to preventing corporate abuse of power. The final confrontation came when Marcus received a phone call from Richard Blackstone himself, the CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The man who had seemed untouchable just days earlier was now facing criminal charges and the complete destruction of his empire. "You have no idea what you've destroyed," Blackstone said, his voice filled with rage and desperation. "The research we were conducting could have changed the world. Now it will take decades to recover what has been lost." Marcus thought about all the people who had suffered and died because of Meridian's experiments, and his response was immediate and unwavering. "Some things are worth destroying," he said, and hung up the phone. Years later, as he watched the last of Meridian's facilities being shut down and its executives being led away in handcuffs, Marcus reflected on the words that had started this entire nightmare. Someone had shouted that this place wouldn't shield him, right as a sniper surfaced from the bog. But in the end, it wasn't the bog that had provided shelter. It was the courage of people like Sarah and Elena, who refused to let evil hide in the shadows. The bog itself had returned to its natural state, no longer a hunting ground for corporate predators, but simply a quiet place where nature reclaimed what had always belonged to it. And sometimes late at night, Marcus would think about that moment when everything changed, when a desperate chase through dangerous terrain had led to the exposure of one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in modern history. The truth, as he had learned, was worth any risk to protect.